It was announced with great fanfare earlier this year that researchers had identified one of the genetic markers that signal a predisposition to serious mental illness, schizophrenia. Right now, if you know you've got that marker, there's not much you can do about it, but it does hold promise for future therapies. But if you do know, do you want anyone else to know? Are there people or institutions you definitely not want with that information? And in the 21st century, can you really ensure that information is secure? Your genes, your privacy, it's the Inside Story. Welcome to Inside Story. I'm Ray Suarez. Earlier this year, research funded by the National Institutes of Health achieved an important breakthrough. They now understand the association between a group of genes and the mechanism that sets off schizophrenia in some sufferers of that neurological disorder. In all the known genetic risks for the disorder, it's one particular gene, known as C4, that offers the clearest indication of heightened predisposition for developing what is often a devastating condition. We now know a lot more about inheritability, about genetic markers, about what's happening in the brain of a young person who's showing signs of the disease. On one level, that's great news, because understanding what's going on in the brain, the pruning of the structures that's been growing and developing since the womb, offers the possibility of future countermeasures. But when I heard the story, I also wondered, as useful as it is to know about what your genes say about heightened risk, about predisposition to certain diseases, would I as an individual be able to protect that information, allow it into some hands and not others? That's our focus, your genes, your privacy, this time on the program. Joining me for that conversation, Rebecca Brendel, Director of the Master's Bioethics Program at Harvard University and Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. Jeffrey Lieberman, Chairman of Psychiatry at Columbia University and Director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and Kevin Jones, Professor of Biology at Howard University and President of the D.C. area chapter of the Society for Neuroscience. Professor Jones, this strikes me, a layman, as a pretty big deal.
It is. It's a really big deal, Ray. For a long time, scientists have been trying to understand the biological underpinnings of this very complex disorder of schizophrenia. There have been a lot of clues in the past, but when they discovered the role of the C4A gene, it really caused a lot of ripples throughout the community. It's a really big deal.
Is the relationship so tight that you can tell the genetic makeup of a schizophrenic from either looking at the gene or predict that someone's going to develop it by seeing it in advance?
Well, it's a correlation, and so what this means is that any individual that has these particular mutations, that they are predisposed for the disease. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation. So the short answer is no, but it's probably the strongest genetic insult that we've discovered so far.
Now, this is still pretty new information. Will more research be required to know just how intimate that predisposition is?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the interesting things about diseases like schizophrenia is that there's a strong heritable component, which is what this research shows, but there's also an environmental component, because, for example, there are several instances where you'll have identical twins, and maybe one twin will have the disorder, and the identical twin, the other one, will not show symptoms of the disorder. And so we know that, of course, there's a strong heritable component, but one of the most fascinating areas, that there are also environmental insults, which we don't clearly understand yet.
So, Dr. Lieberman, it sounds like we don't know quite what to do yet, or whether we would tell an individual who has this marker how to live or what not to do.
Well, I think the biggest challenge, Ray, is not for the scientists or for the doctors. I think we know what to do with the information. It's really for you, a journalist in the media. How do you explain it to the public without overstating the importance and raising expectations prematurely? This finding had a huge impact, as Professor Jones mentioned, but it's not a singular or anomalous finding. This is one more piece of a puzzle that's been being assembled for many, many years. It just happens it's a very big and significant piece of the puzzle. And the reason why it's big and significant is because it was the finding of a very strong signal for a particular set of genes that link up with probably one of the most important pathophysiological theories of the illness. In other words, many genes have previously been associated with the diagnosis of an illness, schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, depression. But in this case, the particular gene, C4 genes, produces an effect on a physiologic process called synaptic pruning, or elimination of synapses. And there had, many years ago, 1980s to be specific, a theory proposed that one of the phenomena which triggers schizophrenia is during adolescence, when there's a process of synaptic elimination, and that perhaps in people who become schizophrenic, this process is dysregulated and abnormal and overactive. And the findings with the gene showed exactly that. There was an overexpression, a gain of function in these genes.
Well, Dr. Brendel, now that we know this, but we don't know what to tell an individual, does it create some ethical challenges? If we screen for this, do we tell every individual we find it in? If we find evidence of mental illness, do we run an assay to see if that marker's there? I mean, are there challenges that are created by new knowledge?
Well, you've really identified some of the very many challenges there are when we think about how we translate our learning about genetics into clinical settings, into research settings, and to the individual patient from the bench to the clinic and to the significance for their lives. You know, as you've heard, much of this process of the synaptic pruning happens in late adolescence, and so knowledge about this gene for an individual at a very vulnerable and critical point in their life as they're entering into adulthood and thinking about making decisions for the future, having this knowledge could be helpful, for example, in being aware of symptoms to come, but it could also cause them to be discriminated against in situations where an employer might not want to take a risk on training an individual who might be more likely than someone in the general population to develop what could be a devastating and severe mental illness.
That's where I want to pick it up when we come back, because it's just that knowledge of others beyond the individual, beyond the family, that makes this really complicated. Your genes and your privacy is our ability to understand you down to the molecular level, outrunning our ability to protect you from prying eyes. Stay with us. It's Inside Story.
Al Jazeera America, your world this morning. Real stories, real reporting, real news. A deeper look with an international edge. Al Jazeera America, your world this morning. Weekday morning, 7 Eastern, only on Al Jazeera America.
Are you one of those people who think if you ignore the IRS, they'll go away? Well, the harsh reality is no one can ignore the IRS. No one. If you have received a wage garnishment notice, a bank levy, or have unfiled taxes, or if you have an existing IRS debt of $7,500 or more, then you need to call the tax professionals at OIC Tax today for a solution to your worries. OIC Tax can help you with your wage garnishments, bank levies, tax preparation, installment arrangements, currently non-collectible, offers and compromise, and much more. Our professionals want to ease your worries with your tax burden. You may even qualify for a settlement that could significantly reduce and satisfy your IRS debt, or you may qualify for their hardship program, where you make no payments to the IRS while in this program. Don't wait for tomorrow to tackle your IRS issues. Stop trying to deal with the IRS on your own. Call the real professionals at OIC Tax now for a 15-minute consultation. This is a limited time offer, so call the number on your screen now.
The only live national news show at 11 Eastern.
We start with breaking news.
Fast, smart, and on point.
Let's take a closer look.
Catch up on the important news from today and get a jump on tomorrow. News wrap up at 11 Eastern, only on Al Jazeera America.
You're watching Inside Story. I'm Ray Suarez. We're talking about new breakthroughs in our understanding of what your genes tell us about your potential vulnerabilities, and the two sides to that precious, hard-won coin. More knowledge means more answers in the future, and more knowledge means more that's knowable and potentially known about you at the most intimate level. Rebecca Brendel, Kevin Jones, and Jeffrey Lieberman are still with me. And Dr. Brendel, you were telling us just before the break, you used the example of an employer. Now, I would want to know if someone was prone to schizophrenia, because to me that's more serious than being prone to clumsiness or prone to forgetfulness. Yet, at the same time, there aren't there, legal limits on what I can know about what's lurking in someone's most detailed biological makeup?
Well, we do have some protections for genetic information for individuals, in particular prohibiting discrimination in the context of securing health insurance benefits. That's a 2008 law in this country, and in general, employers would not be able to gain information about one's genetic predisposition any more than any other medical condition, except if it were affecting their ability to do the functions of their job. But it raises even larger questions when it comes to genetic information, because certain kinds of information can be kept private. But genetic information about an individual is unique to that individual. And so the kinds of protections of confidentiality and anonymity that we've used in the past to protect medical information aren't really available to the same extent for one's genetic fingerprint.
Dr. Lieberman, Dr. Brendel mentioned health insurance, but if I were a life insurer, now when I've bought life insurance in the past, I've gotten a physical, they've taken my vitals, given me an EKG, and taken blood to screen for cholesterol and blood sugar. Could they also do a genetic makeup and find out I've got this predisposition to schizophrenia?
And other disorders as well. I mean, I think what's happened with the advent of molecular genetics and the sequencing of the human genome and the ability to do whole genome sequencing on an individual quickly and cheaply is that we've pulled the curtain back, over from the genetic underpinnings of each individual's uniqueness. And the question is, how do we use that information? So you're talking about it in terms of employer interviews and in terms of insurance and how doctors should communicate to, but it's going well beyond that. We're already engaged in the social experiment where through 23andMe or different recreational genetic companies, you can get your gene sequenced, albeit not very precisely, but you can have it done more precisely through your doctor and through a very sophisticated laboratory. The question is, what do you do with that information? So if a very sophisticated consumer goes to their doctor and says, look, I know you can do whole genome sequencing of me, I want to know, and so I'm willing to pay the $1,500 or whatever it costs to do it, that can be done. But then how do you interpret it? It creates not just questions for our society in terms of how it should be available to insurance companies, employers, and the like, but it creates problems for the individual, because if somebody tells you what are the probabilities given your genome for certain predispositions of certain disorders, what are you going to do with that information? It could either drive you crazy, worrying about it, or it could help to prompt you to adapt your lifestyle in a way that avoids you developing a very serious illness.
And Aetna probably has a different level of liability and a different level of legal responsibility from 23andMe. I mean, sure. You spit into a test tube, you put it in a mailer, it comes back and tells you that, well, here's what we know about you now. Can we build in protections that give people a way, and medicine, a way of being in sync with the law, Professor?
I think we need to. I mean, this is a question that has to be addressed. Dr. Brindell pointed out that the GINA law that was passed in 2008. And so that law provides limited protection for individuals who want to get health insurance or get employment. But what it doesn't protect, as you mentioned, for example, individuals that want to get life insurance or disability insurance or any other sorts of protection. So in many ways, we've opened up a Pandora's box simply by the cost of getting your genome becoming so ubiquitous and so affordable now.
There's also an arms race in security. We're having this conversation in the same week that MedStar, a major keeper of medical data, has been hacked, has had its files rifled through, and now hospitals are trying to ensure clients that in fact, that there are steps being taken to ensure their information. And who knows? Can I be sure? Dr. Lieberman, you were just about to jump in there again.
Yeah, Ray, I think you have to make a distinction as to what kind of information this is and how reliable is it to be used. So, for example, a lot of people believe in astrology, right? And so they read their horoscopes every day, and they may or may not, adjust their what they do based on that information. A lot of people believe in nutritional things and nutritional sensitivities, but this stuff does not have scientific validity. And 23andMe and the recreational genetics is all interesting as a conversation piece and provides some type of information, but it isn't really validated in the same way that if you have a blood test for measure your glucose or your hemoglobin, that has scientific validity. What's happening now is that with the capability of doing gene sequencing and knowing what the consequences of the different forms of genes are, we're developing a profile that will become hardened into evidentiary fact on what is the risk for illness. But it's still evolving to that point, and it hasn't reached that point. So when you say an insurance company is going to do an actuarial table based on you having a specific genotype, they will be able to and probably should be able to do that in the future, but it's still evolving. And that's why I said I think a real challenge is how the media communicates this and how the scientific community communicates this, because it's all exciting and people want to know, but at the same time it's hard to say exactly how this is going to apply immediately.
Well, I'm trying to be careful. I'm trying to be careful. So we're going to take this break, and I want to get some insight on what individuals and what conclusions can individuals make about themselves and their own futures. Your genes, your privacy. Stay with us. It's Inside Story.
Coming up at 7 p.m. Eastern on Al Jazeera America, nuclear security. World leaders meet in Washington to discuss the threat of nuclear terrorism, how North Korea figures into that discussion, the fight for New York, why the Big Apple may be Bernie Sanders' last stand, how he plans to win over voters, plus the controversial figure who may be in charge of all school books in Texas and how her influence could be felt nationwide, and equal pay on the pitch, the astonishing pay gap for women in soccer. That and more tonight at 7.
Are you paying too much for your car insurance? Do you need better coverage at a lower price? At Direct Insurance, we save you time and money by matching your needs with the best coverage at the lowest price. Stop listening to the talking animals and cartoon soldiers trying to sell you auto insurance on TV. It's time to get better coverage at a lower price. Call the number on the screen for Direct Insurance. Why pay more than you have to? Call now.
Have you or a loved one been diagnosed with mesothelioma or lung cancer in the past 4 years? Did you work at an industrial site, on an oil and gas rig, in a shipyard, or were you in the military where you were exposed to asbestos? Were you exposed to asbestos as a construction worker, mechanic, or plant worker? Are you a spouse diagnosed with mesothelioma? If diagnosis or death due to mesothelioma or lung cancer was within the past 4 years, you may be entitled to compensation due to asbestos exposure. The law firm of James C. Farrell has 25 years of experience representing asbestos exposure victims and trying their cases. The law firm of James C. Farrell will represent you. We will not refer your case to another firm. You pay nothing unless there is a recovery. Call us 24/7 at 1-800-566-8314. Now is the time to take action. We will personally take care of your case. Call 1-800-566-8314.
Keep watching for the latest news from across America and around the world coming up next.
Welcome back to Inside Story. I'm Ray Suarez. We're talking about the advances in science that hold the promise of taking the mystery out of diseases you or family members may develop, the promise and the peril of knowing you may have a higher than average chance of suffering from a thus far incurable malady or dying an early death. There are legal, ethical, digital privacy implications involved in this new era of medicine. Kevin Jones, Jeffrey Lieberman, and Rebecca Brendel are still here. Counseling, Dr. Brendel, for couples. We talked just briefly earlier about what we're learning about the heritability of various neurological disorders. If we find out more about this C4 and its relationship to schizophrenia, would we go as far eventually as to advise certain couples not to have children?
Well, Ray, we're really a long way off from being able to get to that question, because the critical piece to understand from what we know now about C4 is that there is an association between C4 and developing schizophrenia. However, we also know, as Professor Jones told us earlier in the segment, that even for monozygotic twins, so identical twins with the same genetic information, in those pairs of twins, really roughly only about half of the second twin will develop schizophrenia if the first twin does. So the genetics are really only part of the story. So certainly we don't want to go too far without the knowledge of what the actual risk is.
If I know I have this marker, am I ethically obliged to tell somebody else? Somebody I may be contemplating a long-term relationship with, even if we know that the relationship is not one-to-one, that it's not such an intimate relationship that it's definitely going to mean anything about myself or future children.
It could. It could. I mean, the level of evidence is stronger for some disorders than others. For example, if you have the BRCA2 gene for breast cancer, many women will choose to have prophylactic mastectomies. If you have the ApoE4, if you're homozygous for the ApoE4 gene, your risk of Alzheimer's disease is markedly higher. So if you have one of the more autosomal dominant disorders like cystic fibrosis or Huntington's disease in your family, so in terms of disclosure to potential spouses, it depends on the kind of the honesty and the nature of the relationship. But in most, if I were that person's intended to be, I would want to know that. And you certainly couldn't have been talking about things like this until just in the past couple of years.
And presumably, Professor Jones, in coming years, there will be even more things that we can have that conversation
Absolutely. So one of the goals in genomics is to get to the so-called $100 genome, to where we can get this high-level, sophisticated sequencing, deep-level sequencing on all people for $100. Once that happens, then you'll see the ballgame will completely be different. And then when everyone will be able to have direct access to very high quality genomic information.
But it's not necessarily information that's actionable. I mean, if I find out, as my brother did 23andMe and found a family predisposition to Meniere's syndrome, which leads to deafness down the road, it's not something you can really do anything about.
Yeah, so you're right. I don't think that we've arrived as a society to what do we do. I think this is what Dr. Lieberman was bringing up earlier, that we just haven't come to the point where we know what to do with all this information. And you're right, it's only going to become more and more complicated as the data becomes more ubiquitous.
But for some things, we can make interventions, and also knowing the gene, if there is a strong association like the C4 genes, it points the pharmaceutical and the biotech industries in the direction of treatment development, because they then try and develop a compound, a drug that acts on the gene target.
Yeah, yes, I agree with you 100%, Dr. Bloom, but on the individual level, which I think is what Ray was getting at, is that, so how do you make a decision to perhaps maybe lifestyle changes, perhaps, but you know, these things are not that straightforward all the time.
Well, Dr. Brendel, how do we keep the science from getting way out ahead of the legal world, out of the ethical considerations? How do we keep our big institutions in sync so we're having a humane conversation with each other?
Right, that's a great question, and that's really at the center of this, because if we're too restrictive and we say, look, our ethics aren't ready to address our scientific advances, and people are then discouraged and don't go and volunteer for research or engage in genetic testing, it stymies our ability to progress with our science and to advance our knowledge and the promise of treatment. On the other hand, if we say, well, we need the science and we'll figure it out afterwards, then we could really be in trouble about what the implications are for individuals who, based on too little knowledge of a single fact. So we really have to think carefully and thoughtfully about the principles we know to be true for engaging in medical research and in clinical treatment, in respecting persons, thinking about their well-being, and also thinking about how as a society we choose to together share and bear the potential consequences of what this information should show as we think about how to take care of each other.
Dr. Lieberman, are we looking at a long timeline before some therapeutics come out of this new knowledge about C4 and schizophrenia?
Well, I think we're looking at maybe a decade timeline for therapeutic actionable treatments for C4-based targeted gene treatment. But in terms of the use of genetics for treatment, I think it's happening already. It's happening in cancer to a large degree. It's happening to some degree in cardiovascular and infectious disease, and it's beginning to happen in neuropsychiatric disorders too. I think what's being appreciated of the fact is that many of the treatments that we use now are the equivalent of treating fever with aspirin. It makes your temperature go down, but it doesn't necessarily alleviate the underlying cause. By getting at the genes, we're able to develop treatments that get at the underlying cause, and so it's like peeling an onion to get at the core to see if the onion's a Vidalia onion, a yellow onion, a white onion. And it's happening now, and will continue to really transform medicine.
I want to thank my guests, Kevin Jones, Jeffrey Lieberman, and Rebecca Brendel. That's the Inside Story. Join us tomorrow when we look at the Central American nation of Honduras and the State Department under then-Secretary Hillary Clinton. There was a constitutional crisis and a change of government, and the Clinton State Department was accused of pulling the strings. What does it tell us about the presidential candidate's worldview and diplomatic approach? I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for watching. Good night.